Welcome back. I'm Pastor Mitchell, and whether you are new to APBC or you've been around for a while, I want to say thanks for watching today. You know, as a church, we exist to lead people to trust in and follow Jesus, and we do that by creating opportunities and environments for you to connect with God, with other people, and with the world. Some of those key opportunities are highlighted on the front end of this video. Some of them you'll find on our Facebook page, but wherever you're at in your faith journey, we hope that you find a way to engage with what we are doing as a church. And if at any time you have any questions about faith or what we do together, simply drop me an email at mitchell.deware@gmail.com, and I would love to be able to connect with you. Now, I hope that today's message both encourages and inspires you in taking your next step in trusting in and following Jesus. You know, they say that your sense of smell is closely related to memory. Have you ever heard that before? That when you smell something, it kind of takes you back to a moment or to a time or to a situation that you recall. And so, for example, when you walk in somewhere and you smell brown bread or cookies, right, that might take you back to your grandparents' house from when you were a kid, or maybe to, you know, your parents, whatever it might be. For some, it's the smell of coffee that probably doesn't take you back anywhere except just to the coffee pot. That might be where it takes you. But, you know, you can think of other smells, right? Maybe a perfume or a cologne that kind of takes you back to a moment. Maybe it was your high school prom or your wedding or your, you know, special event with that special person back in your history. And so you think about kind of that sense of smell and how it can take you back somewhere. And aromas have the power to do that. And it's a fascinating thing, that relationship between the sense of smell and your ability to remember things. And you'll know this too, that there's some smells that you smell before you see the thing that you're smelling. You know what I'm talking about? So like you walk into a store and you kind of round the corner and you smell the candle section, right, before you walk into the candle section, if you've ever been there before. In fact, that reminds me of a time when I was down in Freeport, Maine. And if you go down there to all the outlet stores and whatever, there's a Yankee Candle Company. If you know Yankee Candles, right? And they have all those sweet smelling, you know, all kinds of, you know, hundreds, if not thousands of different kind of candles and scented candles. So the minute that you kind of get close to the front door of that store, it's just this little shop there. The minute you get close to that, you're like, oh man, right? And you can kind of smell the whole thing. And you open that door and you walk in and it just kind of, it wafts like the wave of just all these combined smells of candles, even though they have covers on them, right? Kind of just fills the air, and you're walking into a completely different environment. And in fact, it is not the kind of environment you want to take young children into either, because again, glass jars, pop top lids, trying to smell candles. You can just imagine Ryan running through the shop, right? Well, I want to smell that one, and grabbing it off the shelf, probably paying no attention. It wouldn't be long before something smashes to the floor, gets busted, and then you got to pay for that candle, right? And so that's just kind of one of those things. But that sense of smell is an important one. Today we're going to take a look at a passage, excuse me, Mark chapter 14, that there's just going to be this sense of smell that fills a whole house. And what happens is that somebody breaks a bottle of very expensive perfume. And you can imagine the smell that will be associated with that. And as a result of that broken bottle, there are a few people who get really, really upset. So let's pick up the story, Mark chapter 14, starting at verse 1. It says this: Now it was 2 days before the Passover and the feast of unleavened bread. And the chief priests and the scribes were seeking how to arrest him, that's Jesus, by stealth and to kill him. For they said, not during the feast, lest there be an uproar from the people. So we're now coming into the time of the celebration of Passover. This is an annual celebration on the first of the year, of the calendar year for the Jewish people, right? And Passover kind of takes them back to that 1500-ish year tradition of the reminder of the actual event where God led his people out of slavery in Egypt, right? And the 10th plague where with the blood of the lamb on the doorpost, God passed over the homes of the Jewish people, right? As they, as the 10th plague came upon Egypt, and then the Israelite people would leave to be freed from their slavery. And so this is a meal and a moment and a whole celebration that commemorates that event of God's redemption and deliverance. And so we're moving into this kind of thing, and the Feast of Unleavened Bread as part of that celebration, which kind of commemorates again that fast departure, right? They didn't have time to let the bread rise. It's just unleavened. And so this whole thing is going to be happening. Now the chief priests and the scribes, they've been on the outs with Jesus for some time, and even from the beginning of the Gospel of Mark, particularly, we see that there's a point in which the scribes and the Pharisees are unhappy with Jesus and some of the things he's saying and doing. And even from early on, they're kind of plotting about how they can arrest him or disrupt his ministry somehow or prevent him from doing and speaking the things that he's doing and speaking. And so they're kind of out to get him from the get-go. But now Jesus has made his way into Jerusalem, into their turf, into their territory. This is like home base for them. And the tensions have got really high during this past week, and they're about to boil over. And so they are looking for a way to arrest Jesus, but they want to do it by stealth so that they can kill him or have him put to death. So this is going to be a covert operation. Okay, this is kind of behind closed doors, kind of under cover of darkness, kind of behind enemy lines kind of thing. And so this is their plan, and they're looking for that opportunity. It's not going to be out in the open. And part of the reason for that is because they're afraid of the people and their opinion of Jesus and how highly they regard him, because they don't want to be, they don't want to be on the outs with the people too for what they're going to do with Jesus. And so they're aware of that. They're aware that if we do something to him, we might lose the crowd ourselves. And not only that, but because it's Passover, there are literally the city of Jerusalem's population just explodes during Passover. Why? Because people came from all over to celebrate Passover. And particularly, there are also people there from the region of Galilee who were probably supporters of Jesus in his ministry. Perhaps even some people that he had healed. And so they're thinking, look, if we arrest him and have him put to death, we need to do this stealthily, or else we're going to have an even bigger problem on our hands with the crowd. And so they didn't want his arrest to lead to this incredibly volatile situation, particularly around Passover. And so that's why, kind of the stealth aspect to it. Now, here's what Mark tells us happens. That while Jesus was at Bethany, this is just a couple miles outside of the city, right? He's been spending the nights there as he travels into the city by day, goes back out and spends the night in Bethany. Well, he was at Bethany in the house of Simon the leper. He was reclining at table. And a woman came with an alabaster flask of ointment of pure nard, very costly, and she broke the flask and poured it over his head. Now just sit in that moment for a second and just try to smell, right, what that must have been like. Just trying to picture yourself around the table or even in the room, just in the corner, kind of observing all of these things take place, right? So we're in Simon the leper's house. Now, we're not told any more about Simon except that Simon the leper, he presumably used to have leprosy, and we assume from that perhaps Jesus has cured him and healed him. He's reintegrated into society, into his family, and now he's hosting Jesus and the disciples at his house. And during that time when they are sitting around the table, right, they're reclining at the table on cushions, not in chairs, because that's how they sat in that day, was on cushions near the floor. The table was very close to the floor. A woman who's unnamed, we don't know who she is, she came with an alabaster flask of ointment. And so this woman now, we don't know who she is, just what she did. She takes this flask and breaks it. And what this flask is full of is pure nard. Now, pure nard is likely a reference to spikenard. I don't know if you've ever heard of that before. All you essential oils people, if there's any in the room, might have heard of it before. It's a very aromatic oil, right? That's often used for scents, for perfume particularly, right? It's got this really earthy smell to it, right? So it's kind of like musty, woody, spicy, right? Any of you guys remember Speed Stick musk? Right? Like, yeah, the musk scent of Speed Stick. I think it's been discontinued. I read something about it a long time ago. I was like, because who wants to smell like musk anyway? But just honest confession, quite a few years ago, I really liked the musk. That's what I used to use. Anyway, because you needed to know that, right? Okay, so she brings this pure nard that's got this earthy, musky, kind of scent to it, and it's very costly. In fact, we read a few verses later that it's worth about 300 denarii, which is about a year's wages for a common laborer. So you think one whole year's wages is kind of brought into this one flask, this one jar of very costly perfume, which tells us that it was likely in the family for a few generations, right? And not only that, but because of what it is of this nard, it was probably imported from Nepal, because that's the closest place in which you could get this aromatic oil from. And so it's been brought in, probably again, in the family for generations. It would have been used very sparingly on special occasions for certain moments. And this woman just up and breaks the whole jar. And second of all, she pours it all over Jesus' head at the table as they're eating. Okay, so just imagine for a second what this is like. So first, the smell of that, right? You know what it's like. You use perfume, you use cologne sparingly, right? That's usually how you're supposed to do it, right? And so you even see, it's like you don't walk in, you don't just kind of spray it like this. You kind of spray it in front of you, and then you walk into it, right? That's how you're supposed to do it, apparently. And so you don't get it all over you, right? And so now she's got this whole thing, and instead of just kind of spraying a bit of a mist and Jesus, could you just walk through this? She's just like, let's just dump the whole thing over his head. Now I don't know how all this went down, okay? I don't know did Jesus have any warning this was coming? Did anybody else see her coming? Did they hear the bottle break? Like, we're not told only that she did this. Now, this is not good for people who need a scent-free zone. Okay, and so this aroma just fills the whole house. In fact, Carolyn told me earlier on, it's been a few months ago now, about a student at school. She didn't tell me who it was, just that there was a student at school who told her that his mask smelled because, teenagers and masks, and so his mask smelled. And so he went out and got a bottle of spray Axe and sprayed his mask so it would smell better and put it back over his face. And all the teachers at the school are like, you can't do that. Like, you're going to die of something from the Axe, inhaling all of that. But, there's this concern about just how it's going to smell. And so this smell just kind of like fills the whole room. So that's the first thing. But secondly, attached to that is that this is very costly. I mean, isn't this a bit excessive? Right? Like, again, you use these things carefully, sparingly. This is very wasteful. This is the kind of thing that you get after your teenage son or daughter about doing with their perfume or cologne, right? It reminds me of Ryan with toothpaste at the moment, right? And you walk in any morning in our house, and the toothpaste there's just gobs of it in the sink, right? I don't know if he's just missing the brush or if he just, but anyway, he's 4. So this is what happens. This is a grown woman. She's got this broken bottle of perfume. She pours it over Jesus' head. And not only is it smelling the whole house up, but it's very excessive. We might even say wasteful, which is exactly the conclusion that some are drawn to. Right? In fact, here's what Mark tells us happens, verse 4. There were some who said to themselves indignantly, meaning with great anger, why was this ointment wasted like that? For this ointment could have been sold for more than 300 denarii and given to the poor. And then Mark tells us that they begin to scold her in the middle of this whole thing. right? And so they start thinking, and they're getting angry, and then at the table they just kind of like, what are you doing? Like this is wasteful. Like it's smelling up the house. Like we could have sold that, given the money to the poor. You could have kept a little bit and kind of dabbed it, behind his ears or on his neck or something if you wanted to, But listen, like what are you doing? And so they're really kind of upset about this. Now the fascinating thing is there's another episode, not recorded by Mark, but recorded by John in his gospel, of something very similar that happened just 4 days before. And if you recall from John's gospel in chapter 12, I think it is, that John says that it was 4 days earlier from this event that Jesus is at the home of Mary and Martha, right, and Lazarus, right? And so he is there, and during a meal, Mary does something very similar. She comes up to Jesus as he's reclining at the table, again, sitting on a cushion with his feet behind him, and she comes with an alabaster jar with the same amount of the same kind of perfume and pours it on his feet and begins to rub his feet with her hair. You remember that moment? Separate occasion, different thing, very similar with what's going on, but she rubs it on his feet and not his head. And now this moment happens 4 days after. Now in that first moment when Mary did it, Judas throws a fit. And if you recall, it says in John chapter 12 that Judas says the very same thing that feeds the response here. Judas says, what are you doing? All of that costly, expensive perfume could have been sold, worth about 300 denarii. The money could have been given to the poor, right? And so it's Judas that does this. 4 days later, when the similar event happens again, it's not only Judas, but a few others. And so he's pulled a few more people in, and they react in a similar kind of way. Now, the fascinating thing about the first instance with Judas is that John gives us some insight. Here's what John says. John says that Judas said these things about the money being sold and given to the poor, not because Judas cared about the poor, but because Judas had the bank card. And Judas liked to make withdrawals on occasion for himself. Right? Fascinating. He holds the money bag. And so if we could have sold that and given it to the poor, this is an opportunity for Judas to skim a little off the top, to set aside for himself, to spend on his own desires, taking literally from the ministry of Jesus in order to serve himself. And so John tells us this is why Judas said those things. Again, not because he cared about the poor, but because he was self-interested. And now the response of some of the others, whether out of pure heart or other reasons, we're not told, just that the response is the same. Now, there's something else fascinating going on here as well. Jesus then defends her, right, this woman, at this time, just like he did with Mary. He defends her, saying her actions were intended for his burial. Now, that is a fascinating thing to kind of, like, why is he saying that? This is kind of a weird thing. Well, while we line up these kind of two separate events with the 4 days in between, there's something else that we discover that is incredibly fascinating. If you remember, this is the time of the Passover, right? And what would be sacrificed at Passover? A lamb. Right? And that lamb, according to Exodus chapter 12, that lamb, when it was being prepared for Passover, had to be inspected because the Passover lamb was supposed to be without what? No faults, no blemishes, right? No cuts, no kind of pieces of fur missing off it. This is supposed to be the best out of the flock, right? And so it's not to be an imperfect lamb. And so that's the requirement for the Passover lamb. And I came across this, which again, I found to be really, really interesting, that oftentimes what would happen, especially during Jesus' day, when they were preparing the Passover lamb, when the lamb was to be inspected, on the first day of inspection, they would often take oil and they would rub it on the feet and on the hooves and on the ankles of the lamb in order to protect it, right, from further injury, because it would be very easy for a lamb to kind of scuff its foot on a rock or something like that. And so the oil kind of had this protection to it, as well as it helped with the inspection of the lamb. So, again, to keep it from being easily damaged, and as well so they could see whether it had any blemishes. 4 days later, there would be a second inspection of the lamb, because it was supposed to be inspected for 4 days. And then after those 4 days, they would often take take oil and put it on the lamb's head to declare it acceptable for sacrifice. It was free from blemish, right? It had no imperfections in it. Like this was the Passover lamb, presented, prepared, ready to go. And what we see happening with Jesus is his feet are anointed on one day, and 4 days later, his head is anointed, right? With perfume, with aromatic oil, right? And not only that, but in those 4 days, what happens to Jesus in the temple? He's questioned. He's inspected. They're trying to find fault with him. They're trying to see if there's any way they can trip him up to accuse him of breaking the law of Moses. And after 4 days, what happened? Nobody dared ask him any more questions because he was found to be blameless. And so now, in this moment, she pours the oil over Jesus' head, and he says, what she has done has been for my burial. Some in the group are giving her a hard time, but she was expressing her devotion to Jesus, and he not only defends her, but he interprets her actions in light of the Passover and what is about to happen to him. Listen to how Mark tells us. But Jesus said, leave her alone. Why do you trouble her? She has done a beautiful thing to me, for you will always have the poor with you, and whenever you want, you can do good for them. Now, Jesus isn't saying, look, we shouldn't care for the poor. This isn't a slight against the poor by saying, hey, you're always going to have the poor. We're never going to be able to fix the issue of poverty, so we shouldn't try to alleviate the concerns of the poor. That's not what he's saying. He's saying, you will always have the poor with you. You can do good whenever you want, but you will not always have me. She has done what she could. She has anointed my body beforehand for burial. And truly, I say to you, wherever the gospel is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will be told in memory of her. And here we are today, still talking about this event in this moment. Okay, so Jesus comes to her defense, and Judas has had enough, right? He's sick of it. He's tired of this whole refrain. Again, after all, this is the second time that Jesus has justified an expensive perfume in his eyes being wasted, which, by the way, again, prevents him from skimming some off the top of the bank account. And not only that, but Jesus continues to talk about dying and death and his burial and these kinds of things, not reigning as king. And so he's frustrated and he's angry because this is not going the way he wants it to. This is not doing, the direction is not in line with his view of how things should be. And so Judas, being so upset about this, Mark tells us in verse 10, Judas Iscariot, who is one of the 12, went to the chief priests in order to betray him, that is Jesus, to them. And when they heard it, they were glad and promised to give him money. And he sought an opportunity to betray him. And so Judas, having enough, goes to the chief priests, who he knows are looking for a way to put him to death. He knows they're looking for a way to accuse him of something. And so he, as part of the inner circle, knows that he is going to be able to help them with that cause and with that mission. And so he goes and they promise to give him money. Now we know in the end, how much money was Judas paid for his betrayal? 30 pieces of silver. You know what that translates to in today's currency? About $200. This is not saving for retirement. This is not buying his luxury condo on the Mediterranean coastline. This is like a couple $100 he's going to sell Jesus out for. This was, in that day, the price of a slave. And he sees the opportunity, and he becomes the mole. And he's going to begin to trade intelligence and to be able to track Jesus' movements so he can report to the chief priests so they can do their dirty deed. Verse 12, on the first day of unleavened bread, when they sacrificed the Passover lamb, his disciples said to Jesus, where will you have us go and prepare for you to eat the Passover? So now Jesus' disciples, they're going to observe this traditional meal. They're going to be part of the celebration. Now the disciples here may have been included, some outside of the 12 were not really it's not really described for us. It may have included some of the women that were with him, but they say, where are we going to eat the Passover meal? And so Jesus gives them some instructions. that were similar to his instructions about untying the colt in the city when he was going to ride into Jerusalem. He says, I want you to go in and you're going to see someone carrying a water jar, follow them to a house. They're going to take you upstairs. Everything's furnished. I want you to start to prepare the Passover meal there, and we will join you. And by the time we get to verse 17, it says, and when it was evening, he came with the 12. And so they show up, right? And everything is ready. And as they are reclining at the table and eating, again, because they sat on cushions, right, on the floor. In fact, Da Vinci got the painting wrong. Right? If you ever see the Da Vinci, I mean, now again, yes, he's painting in his, kind of the theme and the way that paintings happened in that time, but they're not sitting on tables. They're all not all on one side of the table. They're all kind of circled around the table on cushions, and they're reclining and they're eating. And so then during that meal, Jesus kind of just outs with this statement. Truly, I tell you, one of you will betray me, one who is eating with me. So Jesus knows what's about to go down. Now you can just imagine that in that moment, Judas's heart skipped a beat. He knows something's up. This was supposed to be covert. This was supposed to be like no one was going to know what was going on except those who were a part of it. But he knows and he's aware, which shouldn't have caught Judas off guard. Judas should have probably anticipated that. But Jesus just calls out not the person, but he calls out the event. He calls out the act. He calls out the thing that, hey, there is something going down. And he hints enough that he knows what it is, but he doesn't really kind of address the person around the table. He just says, this is what's going to happen. Now, we know from experience and from the plot of every spy movie you have ever seen, what's the purpose when you find out that there's a plot or a ploy to do something? What is the response supposed to be? That you neutralize the threat. Right? Like you deal with the actual threat. You go after kind of making sure it doesn't happen with the best intelligence that you got. That's how every single spy movie works, right? And it's fascinating that Jesus in this moment does not do that. He doesn't pull Judas aside and say, hey, what are you thinking? Hey, I know you've been taking money off the top, and what happened back there? Like what's going on? He doesn't do that. He just sitting around the table says, hey, I know what's going to take place. One of you is going to betray me, and it's one of you who is eating with me. In other words, it is someone in this room. And then in verse 19, they began to be sorrowful, all the disciples, which is understandable, right? What is he talking about? Right? And they begin to say to one another, well, is it I? Is it me? It couldn't be. It's not me. In fact, the Greek grammar suggests that the anticipated response is negative, right? Surely not me. No, it's not going to be me. No, not I, right? And that's how it goes around the table. But then Jesus says to them, it is one of the 12, one of the inner circle, one of you who's been with me. One of you, who I should be able to trust. One of you who were in this together, and it's going to be one of you who's going to betray me. One, in fact, he says, who is dipping the bread in the dish with me. And that action is not about identifying the betrayer. It's not like Jesus has his fingers dipping in the bread in the dish at the moment, and there's Judas too. And Jesus is like, everybody pay attention, right? Like it's the one who's doing this. No, it's symbolic. It's about the meal. It's about, hey, it's the person who's eating with me. It's about not identifying the betrayer, but the villainy of the act, right? One who is personally close, one who should be able to be counted on. And Jesus says, it's one of you. It's one of the 12. And he continues to say this, verse 21. For the Son of Man goes as it is written of him, which is likely an allusion to Daniel chapter 7, where Daniel speaks prophetically about a day when evil will have its moment. Right? When a reign of evil will have its day, there will be a win for evil, right? There's going to be a moment where, where that's going to happen. But then Jesus says, but woe to that man by whom the Son of Man, that is himself, is betrayed. It would have been better for that man if he would not have been born. In other words, his betrayer faces a far worse fate. And then in the next few moments, we're going to spend some time talking about this evening. In the next few moments, as they were eating, Jesus took bread, and after blessing it, he broke it, he gave it to them, and he said, "Take, this is my body." And he took a cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, and they all drank of it. And he said to them, "This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many. Truly, I tell you, I will not drink again of the fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it new in the kingdom of God." Jesus redefines Passover in that moment. And he says, this is the last time, fellas, that we're going to do this. This is the last time we're going to share in this meal. And whenever you do it again, you're going to be celebrating not that Exodus, but a different Exodus. Not that old covenant, but a new covenant. And every time that you celebrate these moments, it's going to be reinterpreted to be centered around me and what's about to happen to me, because Jesus is going to be the Passover Lamb. And these moments set the stage for the very thing that will change the world. The perfume set the mood, and the silver bought the betrayal. And then Mark tells us simply that when they had sung a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. At the conclusion of the meal, they did what was typically done. At the end of the Passover meal, they would have sung one of the Psalms, Psalm 113 to 118, one of those Psalms, and they left the city, went out to the Mount of Olives just outside the city into that olive grove. And so begins the longest night. And that's where we're going to pick things up next week.